Hello and welcome back to Skepticus. Before we dive in today, I'm going to first hit you with a question. I'm not just going to ask it of you rhetorically, though you can just think about it in your mind if you like. But ideally, I'd like you to pause the video for a second and actually put your comment below. Here's the question I'm going to ask you. Do you believe that God can be disproven? Now, to be clear, I'm being very open-ended when I say that. I mean, you might be thinking the Christian God, Yahweh, or you might be thinking Jesus or the Holy Spirit. But I'm not even trying to limit it to that. I would like to know, before we start this little journey, and you can compare notes when we're done to see if anything has changed your mind, but do you believe it's possible to disprove any God? I bring this up because I am fond of saying on numerous videos that for pretty much every religion that I have ever known, the God proposition is purposely crafted to be an unfalsifiable construct. So every time you try to pin someone down and say this part of your God isn't real or it's bullshit, they always have some way to weasel out because the entire God construct itself is purposely constructed to be unfalsifiable. I believe that you could have a falsifiable God. But if you're going to tell me that God is falsifiable, I would need to have at least some parameter that is a falsifiable parameter, because the traditional Platonic or Neoplatonic view of God, which is this ethereal, omni-everything being, is, I contend, strongly unfalsifiable. Now, for the most part, I haven't gotten too much pushback on this, but a few weeks ago, I did have another commenter essentially say that that's not true. You can falsify God. And I just kind of put it in the back of my mind, like, we'll have to address that at some point in a future video. And then yesterday, I got these comments from someone who was watching my video with Alex O'Connor and Joe Schmidt, where they were talking about 15 atheist slogans that they say we should stop using. And again, in that video, I reiterated my stance that the God construct itself for any religion I've ever seen is unfalsifiable. So I got these replies here from please enter a name. And they're a little hard to go through because please enter a name seems to really want to get into the philosophy on this, but they don't seem to actually know where the punctuation keys are on their keyboard, except for every once in a great while. And I don't normally like to point that out or make fun of it, but when you want to sling accusations like this, but you can't formulate a proper sentence, it is a little problematic. Nevertheless, we'll try to slog through this. And more importantly, I'm going to give you, probably more so than I've ever done in any other video, as careful of a dissection as I can using formal logic as to why I think it is ridiculous that this commenter thinks that they can disprove God. So let's get into this commenter's comment and go from there. Again, this commenter is called Please Enter a Name. And it says, see, this is why I don't take internet skeptics seriously. You can only believe that theism is unfalsifiable or clean to the notion that who created God is only not a good question to ask simply because theists don't care. And if they did, they would realize it's special pleading if you choose to live in complete ignorance and not acquaint yourself with a baseline understanding of philosophy or religion or theology. It's simply a failure to understand who God and what God actually is, not to say there aren't some uneducated Christians and theists or simply just people who don't choose their words carefully and end up saying dumb things like everything needs a creator or give the impression that everything needs a creator. But there's plenty of theists who have answered this. I mean, Joe literally answers it in the clip, and you didn't even bother to finish it, which is why this reaction was really frustrating because you don't really react most of the time. You just play a little bit of it and then pause, do your spiel, and then go to the next one. So first of all, I got to mention, like, the way he ends this comment. The original video from Alex and Joe Schmidt was almost 3 hours long. Now, a lot of times when I do a reaction video, I will play all or most of the original video and interject my comments. But that means that a 10-minute video becomes 30 plus minutes by the time I add my commentary. A 25-minute video becomes well over an hour by the time I add my commentary. So with this video from Alex and Joe Schmidt, it was almost 3 hours in its original form. So no, I'm not going to sit there and play their entire video and then put my commentary over it. It would be a 6-hour video, and nobody wants to watch that. If people don't like the way that I chopped it up, that's fair. But I put the link to the original video there. You can watch the whole thing if you want, but that's a side note. The more important thing here, in my opinion, is that please enter a name is trying to, it's a little hard to parse through the words, but they're trying to cling to this notion that no, you really can disprove God. And I just thought that this was outright ridiculous. So I had originally just responded with laughing face emojis because I thought it seemed silly. And then they doubled down. They said, tell me you've never read an introduction to philosophy and religion without telling me you've never read an introduction to philosophy of religion. Best, this is a question that's coming from a sincere place, but ultimately out of ignorance or just a complete failure to understand altogether. Now, I don't normally get this petty, but again, I would say, tell me that you've never taken an introductory English class without telling me that you've never taken an introductory English class. But fine, we're trying to muddle through your words. So I admittedly thought that this was someone who's trying to say that, talking from a religious perspective. So I said, only a currently religious person can understand religion, obviously. And he replies and says, not a single atheist philosopher thinks who created God is a legitimate objection. At least anyone with a background in philosophy of religion, that is. This is, I know, really hard to follow, but bear with me. We're going to get to the meat of it here. And I'm going to give you what I think are my best logical, syllogistic answers to these things. And then he says, never said anything remotely approximating that. I anticipated this answer. That's why I sent you a video by an atheist philosopher. I don't care if you sent me a video by an atheist philosopher. It doesn't matter to me. It's so funny that we can prove that atheists think that your objections are BS, yet you guys will still use that. Oh, you're a religious person card. Pathetic. I said, what's pathetic is your idea of a proof, because he's talking about proofs, but he hasn't proved anything. And then he says, I quite literally did prove my point, though, and I didn't get an actual rebuttal. There was no point there. At no point in this stream of verbal diarrhea did he actually prove anything. Maybe he thinks that he proved something in the video link that he sent me. But if I have to watch an entire video in order to understand what your point is, I'm sorry, but I have other things to do. And I would have left it at that. But then he started in with a new thread. And this is where I thought, for me at least, it got interesting. He says, debunking the idea that theism is unfalsifiable. I can do it with the problem of evil. The problem of evil posits, I think that's what he meant to put, that it is incompatible. And it seems to be contradictory that an all-loving God will allow death and suffering, especially as much death and suffering as there is. And if he really were all living, it doesn't seem like he would allow evil to exist, which is okay. I think every non-believer has made this argument, but then he takes this quantum leap. He says, thus, we can conclude the idea of sufferings incompatible with an all-loving God. I think he means are incompatible with an all-loving God, making his existence unlikely given our state. There, I falsified theism, that as evidence against theism. I like how he's like, there, I falsified theism. Look at me. I have squared the circle. Then he says, I think the problem is you're confusing with theists, say with theism as a whole claims. Dude, English, man. English. If your goal is just to argue against very specific theists, then go for it. There's plenty of theists that are easy to dunk on. So then I said, except you failed miserably at understanding what theism is. You have baked in an all-loving God. And even if you want to just focus on the common conception of the Christian God, which is presumably all-loving, you've still failed. You are baking in all sorts of assumptions into your proof. And that's when he says, and we're going to get into my syllogistic response here quickly. He says, I was not exclusively talking about the Christian God. I was talking about generic theism more so. I'm not baking in assumptions as proof by definition. One of God's attributes is being all loving, which you're asserting that that's one of God's attributes. I'm getting 2010s atheism vibes from your comment. Like, is that supposed to be an insult? Oh no, not 2010s atheism. Wow, you really showed me. How dare I think about 2010s atheistic ideas? Baking in assumptions, laugh emoji, God, in standard classical theism defined as being all loving. Okay, so I guess people who use the problem of evil as an objection are baking in the assumption that God is all loving. This is such a bad response. So I'm sure he's not going to like my response anyway, but this, I am going to give a full response, not because I think that this blather here actually deserves it. But if you cut through the babble that is in all of these responses, the point he's trying to get at is really pretty simple. He's trying to say that the problem of evil disproves God. I mean, that's really what all of this babble comes down to, that the problem of evil disproves God. So no, that's complete bullshit. Now, that may sound really weird coming from me. I'm an atheist. You might think that I would glom onto any argument that I can, but here's the deal. It is very important to me in my life and in this channel that whenever possible, I am clinging to the most logical and the most efficacious arguments. Anytime you're involved in any issue, let's just say it's not religion. Let's say it's Democrat versus Republican, right? And let's say you hate Democrats. Okay. There's probably 100 good reasons to hate Democrats, right? But when there's so many good reasons to hate Democrats, it can actually undermine your case if you needlessly cling to the shitty reasons to hate Democrats. Do you see my point? In other words, don't waste your time on the rhetorically dubious points because it undermines the deeper point you're trying to get to. So in this whole thing about proving or disproving God, as much as you might think that I would love to disprove the idea of Christian God or any God, I'm not going to bray about such a thing unless I truly feel like I'm on solid rhetorical ground. In this idea that you can disprove God using the problem of evil is so intellectually lazy that it just beggars credulity. Now, I don't know if other people feel like they have other better means to disprove God. But since he brought this up and he is positing the idea of the problem of evil as somehow disproving God, we're going to go through the details. And I'm not just going to sit here and spew words at you. I'm going to do something that I normally don't do on this channel. We're actually going to break down some very simplistic syllogisms. Because in this case, rather than me sitting here and yelling at you and debating against myself, I think it's more effective if we put these into syllogistic form so that you can see where the arguments are and where they break down, at least according to my contention. So let's get into this. So I know that this can sometimes come across as a little bit simplistic or juvenile, but in this case, I have to start off with the old canard of pulling up a definition. And it's not because I think that that's a great way to start a presentation, but he was leaning on this idea that all loving is somehow baked into the word theism. And if you're going to make such bold statements as I can disprove God using the problem of evil, you should at least understand what the words mean. And the simple fact is he doesn't fully understand what the word means. So yes, I am going to pull this up and read it briefly. So theism is a belief in the existence of a God or gods, especially belief in one God as creator of the universe, intervening in it and sustaining a personal relation to his creatures. So the way that I usually refer to this is just that it's a belief in a single personal God. But personal God is not the same as an omnibenevolent or all-loving God. I do understand that in a modern context, we tend to draw our definitions of God from Platonic and Neoplatonic ideals. Neoplatonic ideals, in contrast to old Hebrew ideals, are ideals that look at God as being this great, grand, unifying, ethereal, everywhere, all-powerful, all-everything, highest possible being, but not necessarily being corporeal, not necessarily being anthropomorphic, not necessarily walking amongst us and acting like another of the gods. Like Zeus was not Neoplatonic. Most of the old polytheistic gods were not Neoplatonic or Platonic. The old gods, like Yahweh, were much more personal. Now, personal, of course, didn't mean, or at least didn't usually mean, all loving. It just meant that they were easier for us to conceive of if we're thinking of, oh, I saw the God, I talked to him, I walked beside him, I shook his hand or whatever. You know, like it was just a different form of human with just more powerful and more badassery. But theism does not define that your God has to be a Neoplatonic God. Theism just says that you have this one creator God and there's something about him or her or it that is somehow personal in relation, meaning doesn't mean that he's a good friend of yours. It doesn't mean that he has coffee and beers with you. It doesn't mean that he goes to the driving range with you, but it just means that on some level you think that you can interact with him. You think that he's looking at you. You think that he cares about you. Define care however you want, but it doesn't necessarily mean all loving. So I'm going to go through several different syllogisms here, and I'm going to show you, hopefully, how at every level, the idea that the problem of evil disproves God fails. So let's go through attempt number one. This is the first syllogism, and I am ascribing this syllogism to please enter a name. He did not specifically lay out this syllogism in these exact words. He didn't lay out any exact sentences for that matter, but I think if you look carefully at his comments, I think I have accurately represented the syllogism that he is trying to present here. So attempt number one is an attempt to create a syllogism based on please enter a name's very lacking logic. So the first syllogism is this. The major premise is that God would not allow evil to exist or create it in the first place. The minor premise is that evil exists. The conclusion then is that God does not exist. This is the crux of his argument, that God would not allow evil to exist, and evil exists, therefore God does not exist. He really thinks that he has disproven God with this. But this verdict, ladies and gentlemen, fails. And it fails on multiple counts. I'm not even going to go through all of them because I'm going to just take out the biggest, most glaring hole in this and then revise this for the next syllogism, okay? In my humble opinion, the most glaring hole in this syllogism is in the incredibly subjective idea of evil. Everybody has a different idea of evil. Even Christians, and I know Christians are infamously, all over the board on many theological topics, but what is or is not evil is even more spread out amongst Christians than other doctrinal topics. So trying to get any two people to agree on what is evil is like pulling teeth. And it doesn't matter if you're trying to get two Christians to agree on it. It doesn't matter if you're trying to get a Christian and a Muslim to agree on it. It doesn't matter if you're trying to get a Christian and an atheist to agree on it. trying to get anyone to agree on what even is evil is, I believe strongly, pointless. A good example of this is crimes can definitely come across as being evil, but most people don't think that committing one crime makes you evil. So if I go steal a loaf of bread, even if I'm not hungry, let's just say I did it because I was like, screw it, I want this loaf of bread. Am I evil? I don't think most people would call me evil for that. They might say that I have a jacked up moral compass. They might say that I was being a little too brash that day when I just decided to steal the loaf of bread, but most people wouldn't call me evil for that. If I kill my wife, that may be evil, but even then, if it's one crime and they send me to prison for the next 30 or 40 years or the rest of my life, and I never do another crime in my life, am I an evil person? There's room for debate there. There are people who believe that just having an abortion makes you evil. Or even if you're not personally evil for having an abortion, there are people who believe that the fact that abortions are available anywhere in the world at any time is in and of itself evil. But of course, there's a lot of other people who would argue very stridently with you that not only is it not evil, but that it's healthcare, that it's a woman's right, etc., etc. Not trying to go down that rabbit hole, but what I am trying to do is point out that the definition of evil, or whether evil even exists, is so all over the board that it makes any productive discussion around it almost pointless. That's why whenever you talk about the problem of evil, which was kind of the way that this was framed millennia ago, I don't say the problem of evil. I don't like those terms. Instead, I much prefer the term the problem of suffering. Because suffering, while it's still subjective, because it happens in your head, it's not subjective from the perspective that we look at two different things from two different perspectives and have to argue over whether it's suffering, because suffering is mostly just defined inside your own head. So unless I have some reason to believe that you're trying to pull one over on me, if you say that you're suffering, then you're suffering. Even if I think you have a great life, even if I think you have no reason to suffer, if you say that you're suffering and you're being sincere, then you're suffering. I might think that other people have greater suffering. I might think that you don't really have a good reason to suffer, but that doesn't change the fact that if you say you're suffering, again, unless you think you're just purposely lying to get one over on someone, but generally speaking, if you say that you're suffering, then you're suffering. As opposed to evil, where I can say something's evil and you could say, no, it's not. That's not evil at all. We could argue about that all day. So I greatly prefer to frame this question not as the problem of evil, but the problem of suffering, because I think it takes a lot of this undefinable moral middle ground out of the way. And instead, it frames it in terms of experiences. It frames it in terms of things that all of us are familiar with. Even if you've led the most charmed life imaginable, everybody, at least on some small level, has suffered at one point or another. So we all have some idea in our head of what suffering is. I don't think anyone doubts that suffering exists, as opposed to evil, where some people will argue that evil doesn't even exist. I don't think anyone will argue that suffering exists. So I think it's much more productive to put aside this whole problem of evil moniker and let's change it to problem of suffering. Now, you might think I'm being semantic here, but I'm working towards an end goal. So work with me. Now that we've changed this from the problem of evil to the problem of suffering, we're going to go back to our syllogism, right? So in this case, attempt number 2, the major premise is that God would not allow suffering to exist, or at least he would not create it in the first place. That's possible too. Minor premise is that suffering exists. Conclusion is that God does not exist. If God would not allow suffering and suffering exists, then God does not exist. That gets us, I believe, a little closer. However, despite Please enter names, arrogant and unfounded snark. The simple fact is that God does not automatically imply an all-loving God. So when I say God would not allow suffering to exist, I mean, it may be an angry God. It may be a God who hates us. He wants to assume that, of course, it's an all-loving God. He's assuming the Neoplatonic ideal baked in. So just saying that God would not allow suffering to exist and suffering does exist, therefore God does not exist, implies that you know the nature of God, or at least implies that you are baking in to the nature of God your presuppositions. He wants to bray about his incredible logic, but he can't even be bothered to be precise with his terminology because, as we've already talked about, theism does not automatically imply all loving. In fact, he does seem to think that theism automatically implies all loving, but he's simply demonstrably wrong. But that being said, I'm trying to work with him here and get closer to a syllogism that might get us somewhere around where he's trying to get. So let's go to a third version of our syllogism, right? In this syllogism, we are going to bake in, please enter a name's assumed omnibenevolence or all-lovingness, right? So now our major premise becomes an all-loving God would not allow suffering to exist, or maybe not even create it in the first place. Suffering exists. Conclusion, God does not exist. I think we're getting closer. However, I would tell you that this still fails because you're assuming that God is capable of ceasing all the suffering in the world. Now, please enter a name, or someone else might be screaming at the screen right now because you're thinking, okay, but we have the Platonic ideals. He's all the things. But in this version of the syllogism, I just said, all I granted him was omnibenevolence. So I said, an all-loving God would not allow suffering to exist. Suffering exists. God does not exist. But you can be all-loving, but not be omnipotent, not be omniscient. I mean, I could love my kids greatly, but that doesn't mean that I'm able to stop all of their suffering, right? There are plenty of things that could happen with my kids. They could suffer greatly, hopefully not, but they could suffer greatly. And despite my love, they could still continue to suffer greatly if I am powerless to actually stop it. So that means we need to tweak this a little bit and move on to the fourth version of the syllogism. In this version, I'm going to grant, please enter a name, the full Platonic ideal of God. So no more quibbling over what theism means, no more quibbling over whether this is the old Yahweh from the Old Testament or whether this is the Neoplatonic ideal from the New Testament. I'm granting that. So here is our fourth syllogism updated again. In this syllogism, the major premise is that an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, all-loving God would not allow suffering to exist or would not create it in the first place. The minor premise is that suffering exists. The conclusion is that God does not exist. Now, you may be thinking, now that we've gotten past the definitional squabbles, and now that I've granted that, okay, in this definition, God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and he would not allow suffering to exist. Suffering does exist. Checkmate. We have just disproven God. No, this still fails on multiple levels, and I will explain. How would you like to be one of my advisors? I'm using Skepticus's memberships as a way to allow you to have a voice in the content and the direction of this channel. I hope to see you in the membership pool, and I want to hear your voice in what Skepticus is doing going forward. So first and foremost, there is the problem of how we are defining omnipotence. See, some people like to play this game when they say that God, Yahweh, is omnipotent. Some people take omnipotence to the absolute illogical nth degree, meaning that God can do anything, not just physically anything, not just spiritually anything, but he could even do things that don't make sense. The classic example of this is, can God create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it, right? Because if he can not create a rock that's so heavy he cannot lift it, he's omnipotent or he's not omnipotent because he doesn't have the ability to create that rock. But if he creates the rock and he can't lift it up, he's not omnipotent because he can't lift the rock. I personally don't think that there's much hay to till in this field. Here's why. Because you could argue this several different ways. I think the most productive way to argue this is that, some Christians will say, well, God can only do things that are logically coherent. That may sound like a cop-out. You might think it's weird for me to give Christians credit here. But I agree with them in this scenario because the way that I look at it, and I got this actually from an Alex O'Connor video like a year or so ago, where he was talking to someone about this. And you can say that God is capable of all things, but a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it is not a thing. It's a hypothetical abstract idea, but it could never actually be a thing because to be a thing, it would immediately break the universe. Like the entire universe would become logically coherent if God or anybody were capable of creating a rock so heavy that God could not lift it. Maybe another way to this even more abstract, it might be easier for you to conceptualize is, can God make a triangle with 4 sides? I would say no, because a triangle with 4 sides is not a thing. It's called a square. Okay, so it's not possible even for God to make a triangle with 4 sides, because other than me speaking the words and trying to think about what that would be like, but failing, there is no way to truly conceptualize, and there's certainly no way to create a triangle that has 4 sides on it. Because as soon as you put 4 sides on it, it's not a triangle anymore. Now it's a square or a parallelogram or whatever. So I don't find this particular objection to be that damaging to our syllogism, but I bring it up because there are those people out there who truly claim that God could do anything, even things that are blatantly illogical, even things that just cannot work in our brains. He can create a 10-sided triangle, and he can create a square with no points, no edges. Like he can do anything, right? I don't think that makes sense, but I'm bringing that up as the first objection to the syllogism because it at least is one place or one avenue that theists could take to say, yeah, you have not refuted my point. You have not proven that God is not existent. Again, remember, the syllogism that we're trying to triangulate around is the idea that the omni-everything, the omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent God would not allow suffering or would not create suffering, but suffering exists, therefore God does not exist. But the first thing you have to do is figure out, what do we mean by omnipotence? Because if you think that omnipotence means that you can do illogical things, then God absolutely could create suffering and yet be all loving, even if those feel like they're mutually exclusive. The second objection is that even if we assume that omnipotence does not include logical contradictions, it's fair to ask, and I don't hear a lot of Christians or even atheists ask this, but I think it's fair to ask whether even a classically omnipotent God can actually change the parameters of reality once he's created it. For example, can he create the planet's massively complex weather system? It's so intricate, and the way the weather works across the globe or even localized there's so many variables, it boggles the mind. Even trying to predict the weather tomorrow is extremely challenging. So can he put in place a system that complex that creates all of the weather across the entire globe while also ensuring that natural disasters never cause human suffering. This is something I don't hear many people, even atheists, talk about. I think there's usually this assumption that, well, if God wanted to stop the hurricane, he could. And I think that that is the classical view, that God can create hurricanes. He can stop hurricanes. He can do anything in the natural world that he wants to do. He can flood the whole world if he wants to, right? But I think it's reasonable to say, once you've created the system, then can you tweak one part of the system that goes against everything else? Here's another example. He can create our incredibly expansive ecosystems, all of the plant and animal life, brimming with millions of different species. But then is it possible for him to have all of those species in place, but never have flesh-eating bacteria or deadly viruses or venomous creatures that occasionally bite and or kill humans? Is it logical even to say that you can have this rich zootopia of all of these animals all over the planet, single cell organisms all the way up to massively complex mammals and reptiles and such, and that none of them would ever cause suffering for a human? On a single isolated basis, it's easy to say, well, a snake bit me on the heel yesterday, injected his venom, and I'm in the hospital and I might die, and God could have stopped it. That feels intuitive to say that God could have stopped it. But there's a broader assumption that's wrapped in that, which says, well, if God could stop that, then he would have to stop every instance where a snake would bite anyone, or where a spider would bite anyone, or where any animal at any time would cause suffering of any kind for any human. And I think it's reasonable to look at the entire complexity of the system and say, I don't know if you can do that. You might think that that's incredulous if you believe in the, omnipotent God who can do everything. But put it this way. If I start a simulation, like SimCity or SimEarth or whatever, like a computer game program, when I start the simulation, I can set variables. I can say what the climate's going to be like, and I can say what the rate at which people will procreate, and I can say whether or not it's going to be mountainous or flat terrain. I can probably set all kinds of different variables. But once you hit go, even as the creator, even if I was the programmer of that code, I may not have the ability in the middle of the simulation to actively change it. I'm a programmer, and even if I'm writing a simulation and running the simulation, if I want to change the variables in the simulation, I usually have to stop the simulation, change the variables, and then start again. I'm not saying that God is limited to that, but I'm saying it's not illogical to think that even the omnipotent God, once he created all of the universe, may not be able to tweak every little thing to allow us to avoid every possible instance of suffering. And if you believe that, or if you think that that's somewhat compelling, then it means that you can be an all-loving God and you can still have suffering. The third objection to the syllogism is that while not everyone believes in free will, and that's a whole big debate we're not getting into today, it is reasonable to conclude, if you believe in free will, that suffering and free will are, on some level, inseparable. For example, nobody would be killed by the next tsunami if God forced everyone who is living in that particular stretch of coastline to move inland well in advance of the tidal wave. But if you preserve everyone's absolute free will, then it's inevitable that some people, no matter how much you beg them to leave, won't. Some people will stay. Some people will get hit by the tsunami. Some people will die in the tsunami. Some people won't die, but they will have miserable suffering because of the effects of the tsunami. Because if we have free will, and even if God came to every one of us in a dream and said, you're living on the coast, a tsunami is going to hit next week, you need to get up and leave now. Even if we all believed it was God, some of us would still choose to stay because that's human nature. And some of us would probably then incur suffering. And if you assume that it was my free will to stay in the danger zone, even after I had been warned, then it also means that the loving God, the one who tried to warn me, but also tried to maintain my free will, ultimately couldn't stop me from suffering because I kind of brought it on myself. Even if we assume that God can or should prevent natural disasters, there's a huge wellspring of suffering that emanates from mankind itself. Here's what I mean by that. If I cause my neighbor to suffer, God cannot keep that from happening without violating either my free will or his. I mean, if I walk over there and I decide I'm going to beat my neighbor's ass today, and my neighbor's pretty fit, so maybe he'd beat my ass. I don't know. But if I decide I'm going to go over there and get in a fight with him, of course, if someone doesn't somehow stop that fight, then probably at least one of us is going to suffer, right? Because one of us is going to get the worst of the altercation. But if we're both hell-bent on having this altercation, then the only way to truly stop it is to interject in my free will or his free will or both of our free wills. Again, it's easy to believe that if free will is a thing, then suffering, to some extent at least, might be inseparable from it. So like in that example I gave, maybe God is trying to do everything he can to get me not to go over and fight my neighbor. But if me and my neighbor are just hell-bent on the idea that we're going to go out and have a brawl in the street, at the end of the day, if we have free will, then even a loving God can't fully stop that. For that matter, one more thing here before we move on to the next point. Much of our suffering isn't even with people around us. It's caused internally. So I could choose to start doing hard drugs. I could start doing heroin or methamphetamine. And if you know anything about hard drugs, that will probably cause me some degree of suffering up to and including death. But again, if I'm hell-bent on doing hard drugs, then the only way to ensure that I never do them is to somehow violate my free will. You could physically restrain me, like throw me into a rehab facility and lock me away, but that's violating my free will. God could get in my brain and change the way I think so I no longer want the drugs, which may sound like a good deal, but that violates my free will. So if you believe in free will, then I think it is erroneous to say that an all-loving God would not allow suffering. Suffering exists, therefore God does not exist. It just does not follow. Now, I understand a lot of people, especially skeptics and atheists, don't believe in free will, but it's ridiculous to think that you've just proven that there's suffering in the world, therefore God doesn't exist. That is so beyond logic that you're just, honestly, you're just being really arrogant at that point. The fourth point on this is that even stepping back a bit, it's unproven at best to blindly assert that an all-loving God would not allow suffering to exist. I know that may sound weird on the surface because the basic aspects of the syllogism says an all-loving God would not allow suffering to exist. Suffering exists, therefore God does not exist. But your first premise that an all-loving God would not allow suffering to exist assumes that being all-loving and allowing suffering are mutually exclusive. And that's not necessarily known or agreed to by everyone. I mean, most theists attribute at least some degree of teaching to their suffering, right? They assume that some of their suffering is brought upon us by God's will. Or at a minimum, even if God isn't bringing the suffering on us, he's at least allowing us to suffer. He's allowing it to come upon us. And that there's some type of growth or lesson that we're to take from that experience. Now, I personally think that this can get pretty toxic to go down this mental path, but I'm just telling you that if your assumption is that an all-loving God would not allow suffering to exist, suffering exists, therefore there's no God, you're making the assumption that an all-loving God would never, ever allow suffering to exist. And I don't think that that's a given. It's not proven in any respect. You're just asserting it. And there's plenty of room for anyone, theist or not, to argue the other point. You've proven nothing at this point. Fifth, the premise that an all-loving God would not allow any suffering to exist for any reason seems, well, hopelessly naive. And it fails to acknowledge that suffering as a unit is not a single atomic value. So when we talk about the problem of evil or the problem of suffering, usually the first thing that comes to our mind is epic suffering. You know, you're being beaten as a slave, or you are dying of a slow wasting disease, or you're dying through some horrible, violent event, you know, horrible life altering events. But that's not all of what's entailed in suffering. See, everyone on this planet, no matter how blessed your life is, suffers at least a little bit. Like, for example, when they get stuck by a needle for a vaccination. Now, you might say that's not a whole lot of suffering, but you know, there are people that are afraid of needles. There are just people that just can't even deal with the slightest pain. I mean, I'm not saying it's epic suffering, but if I stick a needle in your arm of any type, there's some suffering that's associated with that. Let's take the medical aspect out of it. If I just took a push pin and stuck it in your arm, I think you would agree that on some small level, that's suffering, even though it's only a little bit of suffering. So if that pin is not a push pin, but is instead a hypodermic needle, that also is at least some small amount of suffering that you're enduring in order to get the vaccination. Now, the common understanding, of course, is that this minute level of suffering is hopefully preferable to the far greater suffering that would result from these diseases running rampant, or diseases running rampant in you. So you don't normally, unless you're an anti-vaxxer, you don't normally consider it to be much of a sacrifice to endure this little bit of suffering for the needle in your arm, so that in turn, you don't have the much greater suffering of disease running rampant. But the point is, either way, you're suffering. So if we were to assume that an all-loving God would not allow any suffering, he'd have to turn off our pain receptors, or he'd have to turn off disease entirely. Like, he would have to start completely re-engineering the entire world, because almost anything you do, I mean, stubbing your toe can cause you suffering. No, it's not epic suffering, but it's still suffering. Or let's look at earlier, I discussed the tsunami example, right? So if you force everyone to evacuate, let's just say that God gets in their brains and makes everyone evacuate from the coast because a tsunami is coming. God loves you. He's all loving. He does not want you to get destroyed by the tsunami. And he doesn't even make it optional. He gets in your brain and he is determined that you are going to get your ass up and evacuate away from the coast. So presumably, assuming that God knows what he's doing, that would keep you from suffering through the tidal wave's impact. But the hurried relocation itself also inevitably has potential to cause other forms of suffering for many people. Some people wouldn't have a place to stay and they'd be homeless, or they'd be hungry, or they would be, subject to other diseases and things because they're not in their safe environment. Some people might be victimized on the streets because they're not in their friend groups with family and people that they're safe around. I mean, there are 1,000 different ways that people can suffer through a forced evacuation like that. Even if the suffering is just massive stress that you are feeling from having to go through this process, that's suffering. So the idea that we could somehow eliminate all suffering, to me, implies that you'd literally have to rewrite the entire human brain, and you'd have to rewrite the entire external human experience in order to accommodate it. Even if we assume that God could simply stop all the negative events from ever occurring at all, that ignores the fact that even bad outcomes sometimes, or even usually, have positive outcomes that are associated with them. For example, there's a forest fire, and on the surface, this is very scary. I mean, the forest fire comes through and it destroys some homes. It may even take some lives, which is tragic. But the forest fire also rejuvenates the forest ecosystem itself. And we know from experience that in large-scale forest systems, if you artificially suppress any fire at all for years or decades at a time, in the long run, that has deleterious effects. So my sixth point on this is that I think it's very reasonable. I've kind of hinted at this already, but I think it's very reasonable to ask whether it's even possible for all suffering to cease. And yes, I know what I'm saying when I utter those words, because you might think, well, he's omnipotent. He can do whatever he wants. I don't even know, under the auspices of a supposedly perfectly all-loving God who is totally omnipotent, if it's even possible for there to be no suffering. For example, as long as we continue to establish interpersonal relationships, those relationships will inevitably spawn some degree of suffering. Even under the best circumstances, sometimes you break up with people, and that shit hurts. Sometimes we have misunderstandings between each other, and they fester, and they get under our skin. Sometimes our feelings get trampled. Even if you have the most lovely relationship with someone you could possibly have, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's a family member or whatever, one day you wake up and they're dead. They've passed away. And after that happens, you will suffer. You will experience at least some degree of suffering, no matter how much we want to say, oh, he's gone to a better place. Oh, I'm so happy that he's gone to be with his Father in heaven. You can say that all you want. But if you are close to this person, if they meant something to you personally, you will, at least on some level, suffer once they're gone. And I can't even imagine an environment where that wouldn't lead to some suffering. In order to eliminate that suffering, God would have to fundamentally rewire everything about our brains, which means that God would have to fundamentally change everything about the human experience. If you could actually rewire us so that we never suffered within our interpersonal relationships, even when a loved one passed, I would argue you're not really human anymore, at least not in the way that we think of being human. Also, there are many scenarios where it's seemingly impossible to help one group without at least causing some degree of suffering for another. This is what happens in complex societies. You're always making trade-offs because almost every beneficial decision you make for one group will probably have some negative impact on another group. Now, I'm not saying that all of those negative impacts rise to the level of being suffering, but some of them will be. And I don't think that we can fully eliminate that, because to eliminate that, I think we would have to live on mountains by ourselves. Like anytime you have these complex social interactions, it's inevitable that sometimes when you help one group or person, you're going to hurt another group or another person, and that will inevitably cause suffering. So in those scenarios, the question really isn't how do we stop all suffering, because that's just impractical, or I would argue even impossible. Rather, the question is usually, how do we do the greatest good for the most people while causing the least harm to the smallest number of people? Now, I know some people would argue, but it's God. He can figure out the way to do great good for everyone and no harm for anyone else. But I'm arguing that in order to do that, you'd have to change us into something that is not what we even recognize as humans today. And finally, there is the classic Christian dodge. It goes like this: we can't know or understand God's plan. He's bigger than us. His ways are mysterious. Now, of course, I find this argument to be disgusting, but it is, at least theoretically, a valid counter-argument to this idea that a loving God would never allow any suffering at all. So, for example, it could be argued, I think this is disgusting, but it could be argued that among the victims of a school shooting, one of those children was destined to become the next Hitler. Or you could argue that when you fall victim to a horrible addiction, Maybe you're going to meet your soulmate in rehab. Maybe an earthquake destroys a building in the middle of your city that, harms the neighborhood and harms people. But maybe that building was being leveraged by an oppressive slumlord, or maybe it was used by a drug lord for people, who are getting high. I mean, there's an endless series of hypotheticals that Christians can attach to this. They can always say, no matter how bad the scenario was, they can say it's part of God's plan. And if it hadn't happened that way, God knows that something about it would have been worse otherwise. Now, I think this is a horrible, disgusting dodge. I'm not trying to make this point, but I am making the point that if you want to tell me that your argument that God would not allow suffering or evil, and suffering or evil is in the world, therefore God doesn't exist, that is so simplistic as to just be completely myopic. Because anyone who is involved in theological discussions could, in good faith, make this argument that no, even a loving God sometimes has to do this thing, like to kill the kids because one of them was going to be the next Hitler. And you can always make the argument that no matter how bad things were, it was still God's plan. And if it didn't go that way, it would have been worse because it would have been against God's plan. I mean, it's a completely hypothetical argument that you could never win. And I'm not saying you should ever make that argument, but I am saying it's really Pollyannish to think that you can take this simplistic argument of the problem of evil or the problem of suffering and try to extrapolate that into a proof that God doesn't exist. It's just ridiculously simplistic. The last thing I'm going to say on this is that I don't know this, but I think that what please enter a name is trying quite poorly to communicate isn't really that the problem of evil disproves God. I think they're really trying to get closer to something like the Epicurean paradox. If you're not familiar with the Epicurean paradox, it was formulated during the Platonic era. It's accredited to Epicurus. Who knows if he actually said this, but it's really simple. It goes like this. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Well, then he's not omnipotent. Is he able to prevent evil, but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing to prevent evil, but then where does evil come from? Or is he neither able nor willing to prevent evil, and then why call him God? I think that paradox is very interesting to dissect because it does not disprove God's existence, as much as I would love to say that it does. However, it illustrates that you can poke a plethora of logical holes into this construct for those who stubbornly insist, even in the face of mountains of contrasting evidence, that God is unequivocally omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and perfectly just. For anyone who wants to take that ridiculous omni-everything view of God, I have no problem with you digging into all of these logical arguments to show that if these things are true, then God can't be omnipotent. Or if these things are true, then God can't be all-loving. If these things are true, God can't be omniscient. If these things are true, God can't be omnipresent. Or if these things are true, God can't be perfectly just. I think that all of those discussions are valid and fruitful, in my humble opinion. But there's a difference between knocking down the pillars of his supposed all-everythingness versus using those same arguments to say that God doesn't exist. I think if you are trying to take something like the argument from evil, the problem of evil, and trying to say that this proves God, you just haven't done much homework on it, to be frank. And you're not even engaging with the problem at all. Of course, I don't believe that God exists, but I also can acknowledge that just throwing out the problem of evil, like, checkmate, theist, like, I have solved the whole problem. I have just proven God doesn't exist because I just pulled the string on my back and said, problem of evil, problem of evil. That doesn't work. It's lazy, it's intellectually bankrupt, and it just doesn't work. if you really want anyone to take you seriously, you need to think through this shit better. Because not even an atheist, I think, is really going to take you seriously in that regard. And theist will just laugh you out of the room. Not that they're ever going to take our arguments, but you at least want to be able to have a reasonable intellectual conversation without just throwing bromides at people like, your God doesn't exist because the problem of evil. Checkmate. Like, that's just so simplistic, so stupid, and so lazy. Thank you, everyone, for being here on this episode of God's Troll Army. I want to give special thanks, as always, to my members. You guys are incredible. Love every single one of you. I hope to see the members and everyone who's not a member on this video and all future videos. But until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.